while I was coming up with some questions to ask you today, I realised that your I guess resume, for lack of a better word, is enormous. As Jane and Martin were talking about earlier, the idea of belonging to kind of like modern day churches or like groups and communities of people, and I wanted to ask how you kind of think about what it is that you do in terms of the communities that you're involved in.
It's a good question, because one of the things that every time I go to a community radio conference, for example, people will say, oh, which community does Triple R represent? Because a lot of community radio stations might be focused on a particular language group, for example, or a particular area. And Triple R, the demographic, for want of a better word, that Triple R represents is incredibly diverse. It might range from 15-year-olds to 95-year-olds, people born in Australia, people not born in Australia. What connects Triple R's audience, I think, is a commitment to social justice and an awareness of kind of wanting to be exposed to new ideas and new thoughts. And in some ways, that's how I see my role, as being a conduit or a facilitator between different community groups that together represent that kind of whole.
And because you were a performer as well as a critic as well as a broadcaster, have you ever been a performer and a critic criticising performances at the same time? I wonder if one kind of informs the other. If
one certainly informs the other, but one has also gradually been retired over time. My performance days of I used to do a lot of performance. I used to get up with bands, kind of like back in the 90s, bands like Bikini Kill and Propaganda, and do kind of angry, ranting, kind of like pro-feminist, pro-queer spoken word stuff. But as my own criticism and critical writing started to come to the fore, I started to pull back on the performance side of things. And partially it's because you're thinking with a different part of your brain, in the same way that if you're writing an editorial, it's different to writing a personal blog post. It's different to writing a poem. And as you exercise one part of the brain more, that tends to dominate. So I found that, for example, I was writing more criticism. I was also writing more grant applications at one of the arts organisations I worked at. And that was eating up all my creative energy. Sure. So gradually, bit by bit, the performance side stopped. But certainly an awareness of performance has kind of informed my own critical practice. I am, perhaps because I know that performers can have good nights and bad nights, and I tend to be perhaps a little bit more sympathetic.
Yeah, that's refreshing to hear, Richard. Having grown up in a world of criticism in many ways, and many positive things and some negative things as well. But I guess that's the fine line that you've worked out, because you appreciate the performance side of things, how hard it is to actually get up and do something, to get off your bum and do it. It's fine to sit back and not, but because you're actually proactive in that area as well, I think that's an interesting dichotomy to share the two.
It's an interesting relationship, because I'm really aware of the fact that as a critic, if I've had a really shit day at work, I don't necessarily want to go and see a play that night, because I'm not going to be in the right mood to review it. Whereas a performer doesn't have that opportunity. If they've had a shit day, if they're broken up with their partner, or had an argument with mum, or a check's bounced, or if they're just tired and hungover, whatever, they have to go on stage, and I can ring up the theatre conversely and say, I'm in a really shit mood and I'm probably going to give a really harsh review tonight, so how about I come tomorrow instead? Yeah. So it's interesting being able to, I am in quite a much more privileged position in some ways than a performer might be.
So you mentioned Bikini Kill, and they were on my notes of things that I wanted to talk to you about, and they had a really complicated relationship with criticism and the media, but also as a spoken word poet, I think one of the most... I just kind of want to fan out about Bikini Kill for a second,
sure.
If that's okay.
I've still got the autographed T-shirt at home.
Oh.
It doesn't fit me anymore. But
we can talk about that later. But one of the things that I think is... one of my favourite kind of stories about Bikini Kill is from their very early days, when Kathleen Hanna was doing spoken word and performance poetry, and was told, no one's going to listen to this, you need to set it to music and be in a band. Is that... I don't know, I just kind of want to talk about Bikini Kill for a second. I don't really have a question.
That's interesting, because I think there is... I think that's a very true notion about the vibe of spoken word poetry.
About the audience and who is kind of more likely to... or what's going to get through and what's going to have some kind of like
don't
populist...
assume that people won't be into it.
People like performance poetry.
Yeah.
But I think they find it more accessible, and I wonder if this is just because of the way we've been socialised, that when there is music accompanying a message, it somehow becomes more digestible. And I think that's partially because you respond emotionally to the music. We respond so much more emotionally to music than almost any other art form.
I think Homer Simpson sums that up the best too when he's watching a film. He goes, "Oh, sad music. Oh, it's sad."
But
it does push buttons though.
Yeah, it does. And if you're doing, say you're doing a really political piece of writing, or a really challenging piece of writing, and you're performing that, then in some ways I think matching it with appropriate music is, it's not quite sugar-coating a pill to make the medicine go down, but it's certainly playing on the audience's expectations and to how they receive a message, what they're open to. So, yeah.
There's also that idea of how the audience is behaving when they're hearing it, because I think, you know, obviously when you go and see a punk band, you're in a different state than if you're sitting down watching performance poetry.
Yeah, it's certainly if you're in a pub and a single person is standing on stage talking, people tend to focus much more and listen to all respect someone who's talking. Whereas when a band's playing, and I'm sure everybody who's been to a gig of any kind would know this, there's the bunch of people down the front listening to every note and every moment, and then there's the people standing at the back talking and having a beer, and the music is background noise, and that drives me mad as well.
Yeah.
I kind of want to turn around and shake them going, go and listen to the CD in your lounge room if you're here, show some respect to the artist.
How far towards the front are you? Are you kind of in the middle?
Well, given that I'm very close to 50 now, I'm not quite as robust as I used to be. So yeah, 20 years ago I would have been down the front bouncing around, but now I'm kind of more towards the back, kind of peering over the tall people.
Gotcha. Okay. And I saw also in your bio you've done work with Melbourne Fringe and the National Young Writers Festival and all these places that are kind of very specifically tied to certain places. And I wanted to ask how the cities where events take place, how they kind of inform programming decisions that you make and the kind of the audiences who are likely to show up.
I just wrote about that recently actually for Arts Hub, which is the current day job, because I interviewed Jonathan Holloway, who's the new incoming artistic director of the Melbourne Festival. He'll start we'll start work in April to program for 2016. That'll be his first festival. And he said his first 6 months he's not making any programming decisions whatsoever because he needs to get to understand Melbourne. He needs to know its layers, its tribes, its communities, what makes Melbourne tick. And so once he knows what makes Melbourne tick, then he can try and work out what kind of art Melbourne wants to see. And I think it's really important that a festival like the Melbourne Festival or the Melbourne Fringe or anything else reflects the city that it's in, because otherwise you just get this generic cookie-cutter kind of international arts festival model. And sure, some of that still goes on. People go to certain festivals and go, yep, we'll have that Bangara piece and we'll have, this contemporary dance outfit from Israel.
And we'll put them in town hall.
So there's a certain amount of that goes on, but I think the best festivals and the best festival directors understand the sense of place that matters to a city. And it's one of the reasons why I think Melbourne Fringe is such a fantastic festival. And yes, I'm biased. I was on the board for 7 years. But it's one of the only fringe festivals, the major fringe festivals, so like Adelaide, Edinburgh, and so forth, that is a festival by and for the city it's in. Most of the artists in Edinburgh are not from Edinburgh. Most of the artists in Adelaide or Fringe World over in Perth at the moment aren't local artists, whereas in Melbourne, still something like 90% of the program is Melbourne artists. I think, and that's really unique for a fringe festival. So Melbourne Fringe is an embodiment of the creative soul of this city, and I think any festival programmer needs to get a sense of that soul, of the spirit of the city, the sense of place, the genius loci that makes a city what it is, in order to successfully appeal to the residents and the artists of that city with their programming.
It's also important, like, to residents to see that localness as well, because we have a lot of pride in what we produce, and if people are coming in from elsewhere, we're kind of like, well, where's this money going? It's not coming from, you know, the people that we know, the people that we love. It's, you know...
There's definitely some of that going on, and that's a really tricky balancing act as well, because you want to see your local artists, but at the same time there's perhaps a sense that, well, we can see the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra any day. We want to see, I don't know, a leading company from overseas. And I think there's still also that whole kind of cultural cringe that goes on in Australia as well, that somehow like Cedar Lake Dance Company are more important and more significant than Phillip Adams Ballet Lab just because they're from the USA. And that's not necessarily the case. We do tend to still, I think, I don't know, kowtow, for want of a better word, to international acts because we don't necessarily think our acts are good enough until they've proved themselves overseas. The Babadook, the film, is a great example of that. Opened in Australia, terrible box office, closed after about 2 weeks, but then word of mouth overseas, more and more festivals, more and more critical acclaim, suddenly people start talking about it.
Yeah.
Richard, how far-reaching for festivals? I do get the image, only because I live in a city myself, that there's so many things based in Melbourne City itself. What about the future of to spread further into the areas where these newer suburbs that are exactly where we need people to have these festivals at? Is that happening?
Well, that's probably a question for Martin Foley more than me.
That's true.
But look, I think we've got a really good, strong network of performing arts spaces outside of the CBD. So you've got places like the Drum Theatre over in Dandenong, the Clock Tower in Moonee Ponds. You've got good, strong regional performing arts centres as well.
Yes.
And certainly organisations like Regional Arts Victoria, which are then working with kind of communities.
And touring and
the challenge is that for those centres, there's still a commercial imperative. And I think one of the things I would certainly like to see is perhaps greater funding to enable places like that to make programming based more on artistic merit rather than whether it's going to be profitable. I mean, there's a show on at Arts Centre Melbourne at the moment, Thriller Live. Not a lot of kind of real artistic merit in that show, but it's a huge
unless you're a huge
success.
Michael Jackson
fan. Well, yeah. But it almost fits into the heritage arts category because it's recreating essentially a dead culture. So I would like to see Arts Centre Melbourne and the Drum Theatre and the Clock Tower and all these places be able to program more, work with more artistic merit, but they still need to balance out that commercial imperative as well. So so they need more funding. Martin, are you still here?
The emergence too of young creatives and writers and things like that. How do you see that at the moment, and where are they mostly coming from in your view of like the young sort of?
I think it's the classic thing that a lot of people in places like Perth and Adelaide, for example, there's great work being made there, and then they're faced with the challenge of, do they stay there and fight to make a stronger culture, or do they move somewhere like Melbourne and Sydney where there is already a strong culture that they can participate in? I see this with writers, I see this with musicians, I see this with visual artists and performing artists, that they're constantly having this struggle of trying to carve out a culture in their own location. And this certainly applies to regional areas as well, places like Echuca and Shepparton and so forth. Do they stay there and beat their head against a wall trying to create change and trying to build up a network, or do they come to Melbourne and possibly end up then diluting themselves and getting lost, and perhaps risking their own innate creativity because they're suddenly going to start making work that's fashionable rather than conforming to their own kind of artistic drive. It's a constant struggle for young artists.
There's also the threat of getting kind of lost in the noise of that like bigger pool as well, whereas in the smaller places you can kind of be the person who does this one thing, whereas when you go to find your community, you're just one of many.
Yeah. And it's really interesting, the whole sea change phenomenon or tree change phenomenon. There's a lot of artists who I know hit about 40 and then decide to move back to the country. They may have grown up in the country, for example, moved to Melbourne at 18, 19, 20, spent 20 years getting more confident about their work, and then they actually start to return to the areas they grew up, sometimes because they just miss friends and family, other times because they want to go back and reseed some of the experience they've gained and the benefit they've had, and kind of add to that kind of rural diversity and richness.
And an area that I grew up in, I went to RMIT, did media studies and studied television and film and radio there, and we had our own TV studio, and that's why the demise of Channel 31 and other community television stations is pretty sad, and that was another fabulous outlet as well that people had.
Yeah. And this is one of the things coming from volunteering at Triple R and community radio. The community radio sector's fought a really strong national campaign to try and save community radio funding. That was good. Community TV, unfortunately, not. It's the federal government has gone, community television, no, we don't need that. Go and do something online.
You will watch your YouTube things, don't you?
Yeah. So, which I think is a really short-sighted decision, because as we've seen from Channel 31 and other community TV stations around the world, they're a real seeding ground for talent. Rove McManus is the classic example, who gets kind of brought up time and time again, cut his teeth at Channel 31, now internationally recognised. So it's kind of like, we need to keep supporting grassroots arts and culture, and television is part of culture, even if Channel 9 sometimes don't really seem to guess that.
Well, one of my first gigs was mid-dawn Triple R years and years ago. Yeah, that was, I was studying radio, but I wasn't that. I don't think the audience really dug me, so I think it's better we have people like you around, Richard, on Triple R. So thank you very much. I think it might be a baton passing time again. Cool. So thank you very much to Brodie Lancaster and Richard Watts.